Three innocent children vanished without a trace in 1988. No clues, no witnesses, just silence. For 16 years, their family searched, shattered by the unknown, until something unexplainable surfaced. What happened in that house still chills the town to this day. Stay with us till the end, because the truth is far darker than anyone could have imagined. Subscribe now and hit the bell. You won't want to miss what's buried in this mystery. October 3rd, 1988. It had been a mild Monday morning in Fairfield, a quiet little suburb on the outskirts of Portland, Oregon. Autumn had begun its slow creep across the neighborhood. Crimson leaves spiraling on its sidewalks, the air just cold enough to keep sweaters zipped and breaths visible. On Aldergrove Lane, nothing ever happened. Neighbors waved from porches, kids biked home before dusk, and life stayed simple. But by nightfall, something had happened that would stain the street's reputation forever. The Caldwell home stood at the end of the cul-de-sac, a modest blue-paneled two-story house with a tire swing swaying lazily from a large oak in the yard. The children, Lena, 9, her younger sister Emily, 7, and their cousin Josh, 5, had been outside playing in the front yard right after their mother had handed them each a juice box. At 2:46 p.m., Heather Caldwell had waved from the kitchen window as she scrubbed dishes, watching the girls giggle over sidewalk chalk drawings while Josh spun in dizzying circles, pretending to be a helicopter. Less than 10 minutes later, when she glanced again, they were gone. There had been no scream, no commotion, just silence. The juice boxes were left on the grass, barely touched. Emily's pink sneaker was a few feet away from the sidewalk, its heel crushed as if it had been stepped out of mid-run. Josh's toy dinosaur was lying near the base of the mailbox, its plastic tail broken. Lena's chalk drawing, a wobbly unicorn with a rainbow mane, stopped halfway, like her hand had just let go. Heather called their names first. Calmly at first, like a game of hide-and-seek. But as the minutes passed and the silence deepened, something primal began to churn in her gut. She rushed down the porch, steps barefoot, heart pounding, shouting their names louder. The neighbors came out one by one, startled by her panic. Within 20 minutes, people were checking garages, peeking behind sheds, even looking under cars. But the children were nowhere. By 3:40 p.m., police sirens echoed down Aldergrove Lane. Detectives Mark Rendell and Joan Maris were the first on the scene. They had seen their share of runaways and bitter custody disputes, but something about this case chilled them. The disappearance was too clean. No signs of struggle, no witnesses, no vehicles reported, and no noise. 3 children gone in broad daylight from their own front yard. The Caldwells, Heather, and her husband James, were kept in a separate room for questioning. Both were inconsolable. James's face had turned a shade of gray that made him unrecognizable. He had raced home from the hardware store after Heather called him screaming. Heather sat on the couch rocking back and forth, whispering her daughter's names over and over like a broken spell. Their cousin Josh was the son of Heather's sister, Angela, who had dropped him off that morning so she could attend a hospital appointment. When she returned to find her boy missing too, the scream she let out tore through the house like glass breaking. By nightfall, the entire street was cordoned off. Search dogs were brought in. Helicopters hovered overhead, spotlights combing the woods that border the neighborhood. Hundreds of volunteers showed up with flashlights, calling out into the trees. But there were no footprints, no tire tracks, no sightings, no ransom notes, just the echo of unanswered questions. The media jumped on it the next morning. 3 children vanish without a trace in Fairfield was the headline on every local paper. The story spread statewide. Heather and James were interviewed on the evening news, their tear-streaked faces pleading for anyone who might have seen something, anything. They offered rewards. Flyers with the children's faces were plastered on every telephone pole in the county. Schools, churches, even gas stations held prayer vigils. But days turned into weeks. Weeks into months. Nothing. The Caldwells' once joyful home became a mausoleum. Emily's stuffed animals still sat on her neatly made bed. Lena's art projects were pinned to the wall with thumbtacks that had begun to rust. Josh's small backpack was left by the door. Heather refused to clean up. She believed, no, she knew they would come back. James, on the other hand, began to wither. He stopped shaving, lost his job after missing too many days. He spent his nights sitting on the porch in silence, sometimes whispering into the night, sometimes screaming at shadows. Angela moved in with them for a while, but grief turned into bitterness, and eventually she moved away. Her marriage didn't survive. Neither did James and Heather's, not really. The investigation went cold by the following year. No suspects, no leads, no evidence of abduction. There were wild theories, of course. Some claimed it was a cult. Others said the children had wandered into the woods and been taken by a drifter. One elderly neighbor insisted she had seen a man in a black coat watching the Caldwell house for weeks, but no one else had seen him. Another claimed she saw a van with no plates parked near the woods a few nights before, but nothing ever came of it. Over time, the flyers weathered and curled in the rain. The news stopped covering the story. People forgot, but the Caldwells never did. By 1995, James had moved into a one-bedroom apartment downtown. Heather lived alone in the old house, the yard overgrown, the paint peeling, but the children's rooms remained untouched. She started seeing a therapist, got a job at a local library, lived quietly, politely, but carried a permanent vacancy in her eyes. She avoided holidays, didn't hang up decorations, stopped answering Christmas cards, and then, 16 years after that October day, everything changed. It was February 11th, 2004, a bitter cold Wednesday. A routine police call had come from a decaying barn outside the town of Tillamook, over 70 miles from Fairfield. A local man had reported strange noises coming from the barn on his newly inherited property, scraping sounds like something clawing against wood. He assumed it was animals. But what the responding officers found was an animal. Inside a padlocked cellar beneath the barn floor, buried under old crates and damp soil, they found 3 individuals, 2 females and 1 male, huddled under a pile of stained blankets. Malnourished, eyes like sunken wells, skin pale and almost translucent. They flinched at flashlights like feral things. They weren't children anymore. DNA tests confirmed the impossible. They were Lena Caldwell, now 25, Emily Caldwell, 23, and Josh Carr, 21. The world erupted. The story returned to the front page. News vans camped outside the Caldwell home for weeks. Talk shows invited experts to speculate. But the mystery that had gripped the community for nearly 2 decades was far from resolved. The 3 young adults spoke very little. At first, they didn't speak at all. When they did, the details that emerged sent tremors through the room. They remembered being taken. They remembered a man, a voice, a series of locked rooms, the smell of mildew, the feeling of time stopping. They described a dim underground place with flickering light, a narrow passage, and doors that groaned when opened. The man, whom they never saw clearly, only spoke through speakers, distorted and robotic. He gave them food, basic clothing, books, but never daylight. They didn't know how long they'd been gone. What shocked everyone was what they remembered last. They remembered a woman's voice, soft, shaking, familiar, on the other side of a wall, calling their names. But it wasn't their mother's voice. It was someone else's, and she was crying. By the end of the first week, the barn had been sealed off. Forensics teams combed it inch by inch. Behind one of the walls, they found speakers. In the ceiling, old surveillance cameras. Some didn't work. Some were still blinking. Under the floorboards were shelves of journals, notebooks, drawings. Drawings that Lena had made. Drawings of the outside world. Of the house they were taken from. Of her mother's face. And of a strange symbol. A circle with 4 slashes through it. Repeatedly drawn on every page. Authorities had no idea what it meant. What had happened for 16 years in that hidden cellar? Who had taken them? And why were they kept alive? How had they remained hidden for so long? And more urgently, why did none of them remember ever seeing the face of the person who kept them? The deeper the investigators dug, the stranger it all became. The property records where the barn was located had been tampered with, sold multiple times under false names. Neighbors claimed the barn had been abandoned since the 80s. but a few swore they'd heard music coming from it over the years. Music that always stopped the second someone approached. Heather Caldwell stood at the edge of the barn's threshold the day she was allowed to see it. She didn't step inside. Her knees buckled, and she dropped to the dirt floor, sobbing. James stood a few feet behind her, his face hidden behind trembling hands. It wasn't a reunion. Not really. It was the beginning of something else. The case had been reopened. But what the Caldwells didn't know, what nobody knew, was that the barn had one more secret. Hidden behind the far wall, in a space so tight it was missed during the first few searches, was a tunnel. A tunnel that led into darkness. And inside that tunnel, something was waiting. Something that would shatter every truth the Caldwell family thought they had found. The tunnel was just wide enough for a man to crawl through, though not comfortably. It extended from the back wall of the barn cellar, behind a stack of rotted timber that had long disguised its existence. It was discovered 2 weeks after the Caldwell children had been rescued, during a secondary forensic sweep. One officer noticed a draft in the far corner. Another noticed claw marks in the wood. No, not claw marks exactly, scratches. Desperate ones. The kind that suggested someone had once tried to get out, or maybe tried to get in. The walls were packed, dirt reinforced with slats of moldy plywood and steel rods. Wires ran along the top, coated in years of dust, leading to nowhere, or so it seemed. A forensic specialist followed them nearly 60 feet in, flashlight flickering in the stale dark, until he reached what looked like a crude electrical panel embedded in the wall. And beneath that, more drawings, dozens of them, taped up like wallpaper. Some were childlike in simplicity, stick figures holding hands, trees with red leaves, the outline of a bicycle. But others were unsettling. Grotesquely detailed sketches of eyes staring from shadows, of mouths sewn shut, of faceless silhouettes with elongated limbs reaching for something that was never drawn. There was a single phrase scrawled again and again, smeared in pencil and faded ink. "We don't sleep when she cries." Nobody knew what it meant. Not yet. Lena hadn't spoken since the barn. Emily had uttered a few words. Yes, they remembered the barn. They remembered the dark. They remembered being watched. But each attempt to recall specifics left her shaking violently, sometimes even vomiting. Josh, the youngest when they were taken, had regressed entirely into himself. He sat in corners, rocked back and forth, wouldn't eat unless the food came wrapped, and every night he screamed in his sleep. The trauma specialist assigned to the case had no roadmap. The survivors had grown up in isolation. Their entire adolescence had been shaped by unseen eyes, artificial light, and silence. Their development was fractured. Emotionally, they were unstable. But physically, they were relatively healthy. Too healthy. Tests revealed they had been given regular nutrition, clean water, medical care, even supplements. Blood work suggested the presence of common vaccinations administered during captivity. Someone had been taking care of them. Someone had made sure they were kept alive, but just barely tethered to sanity. But why? And why release them now? Those were the questions no one could answer. Heather moved back in with James for the first time in a decade. Their children, grown strangers now, had been placed in psychological care under round-the-clock monitoring. Authorities kept the location secret. The media, desperate for another exclusive, hovered like vultures, but the police kept them at bay for a while. Meanwhile, detectives reopened the case files from 1988, files that had long collected dust in the archives of the Multnomah County Precinct. The original investigators, Rindle and Maris, were both retired but contacted. Maris, now a frail woman living in assisted care, muttered a strange phrase when she heard the names. They heard the lullaby, didn't they? When pressed, she shook her head and wouldn't say more. Detective Reese Hamilton, the new lead, didn't like any of it. The facts didn't add up. Whoever had taken the children had done so with surgical precision. No ransom, no contact, no fingerprints, and yet no murder. It was as if the children had been removed from the world, quarantined for reasons unknown, and returned after their usefulness had expired. But useful for what? 2 weeks after the tunnel was discovered, Lena finally spoke. It was 3:12 a.m. She had been sitting in a chair in her room, staring at a blank wall. A nurse had been adjusting the monitors nearby when Lena whispered something so softly it was almost inaudible. He called himself Father Clay. The nurse turned. "What did you say, Lena?" Her eyes didn't blink. He wasn't real, just his voice. But we listened. Over the next few days, pieces began to emerge, fragmented, disjointed, but revealing. The man they called Father Clay never showed his face. They only ever heard him through the intercom system, an old, crackling speaker hidden in the walls. His voice had a mechanical cadence, like it had been distorted on purpose. He would speak at night, giving instructions, telling stories, reading from what he called the Book of Preparation. Lena remembered some of it, odd parables about purity, obedience, and the end of the surface world. He told them the outside was poisoned, that their parents had abandoned them, that he had saved them from a world that was going to burn in the cleansing. He taught them how to pray, not to God, but to something else, something he called the Hollow Mother. Emily described a ritual room, a narrow space in the tunnel, lit by a single overhead bulb, where they were forced to kneel in front of a wall covered in mirrors. Except they weren't allowed to look into the mirrors. They had to bow. They had to recite strange chants. "She listens when we obey," Emily whispered. "She cries when we forget." Authorities investigated religious groups in the region. Cults, survivalist communities. Nothing matched. There were no known sects worshipping a figure called the Hollow Mother. No missing religious figures named Father Clay. The property had been owned, on paper, by a string of shell companies that vanished on contact. Even the audio system found in the barn was decades old, rigged in such a way that the recordings could have been triggered remotely. But that was the key word. Recordings. They weren't live messages. The voice they'd heard for 16 years had been pre-recorded. Someone had planned it all in advance. Then came the most chilling revelation. Inside a locked cabinet beneath the barn floor, previously overlooked, investigators found boxes of VHS tapes. Over 200 of them, unlabeled, each numbered. They contained recordings of the children. Every day, every activity, every moment of captivity. Dated, cataloged, observed from multiple angles. The children eating, sleeping, reading, sitting in silence, crying, and always, always that voice. "You are loved. You are chosen. You are the vessels of the mother's new world." Some of the tapes had corrupted, but most were intact. One in particular froze the blood of everyone who watched it. Tape number 137. It showed the children, much younger, maybe aged 11, 9, and 7, sitting in their small room. A familiar droning hum played in the background. Suddenly, Lena turned to the camera and whispered something. "He's not alone anymore." Then the feed went to static. Authorities didn't know what it meant. Neither did Lena. She had no memory of saying it. That's when the second tunnel was discovered. This one branched off from the first, hidden behind a panel in the ritual room Emily described. It led deeper underground, far beyond the barn's original foundation, into a makeshift living quarters. A cot, shelves of canned food, a small desk with yellowed papers, and a mirror. But no photos, no fingerprints, no DNA, just one thing taped to the wall. That same symbol, a circle with 4 slashes through it, and below it, in shaky handwriting, she needed a voice. I became one. Soon, she will speak for herself. The investigation took a darker turn. Officials began to suspect that the abduction of the Caldwell children had not been an isolated event. A deeper dive into regional missing persons cases from the 1980s revealed similar patterns. 3 children had vanished from Salem in 1985, 2 from Eugene in 1987. All were listed as probable runaways. All were unsolved. All had lived near dense forested areas with abandoned properties. Was there a network? Or had one man been traveling, planning, building his twisted theology in silence? What disturbed Reese Hamilton the most was the implication that the Caldwell children weren't the first, and possibly not the last. 2 nights later, a fire broke out at the barn site. Investigators confirmed it was arson. The flames destroyed half the evidence collected, including several of the journals from the hidden desk. Security cameras had been tampered with. No fingerprints. No witnesses. Just black ash where the horror had lived. Lena, Emily, and Josh were moved again. Protective custody. Media silence. But the damage was done. They weren't just survivors anymore. They were targets. And Lena, now awake most nights, drawing obsessively, began sketching a new image. Not the hollow mother. Not the symbol. A face. A pale face with no eyes. And a mouth stretched wide in grief. "She's still crying," Lena said one night, eyes unfocused. "She cries for the ones we left behind." "What ones?" the nurse asked. Lena looked at her. "The ones still underground. They didn't sleep anymore. None of them. Not Josh, who now spent his nights pacing in slow circles around his room. Not Emily, who curled under her sheets whispering numbers that didn't follow any sequence. 49, 41, 49, until her voice gave out. And certainly not Lena, who had taken to drawing in the dark. Paper, walls, even her skin. She drew the face over and over. That pale, eyeless face. Its gaping mouth seemed to stretch further each time. No sé, no hay verbos. Just a void where expression should live. When the therapist asked what it was, she said nothing. But later, she whispered to the nurse, "It waits for light. It can't come if we keep the lights on." By March, the FBI had officially taken over the case. The surviving Caldwell children had been relocated to a secure rehabilitation center in Northern Oregon, far from media access. A psychological support team was assembled, including trauma specialists, cult recovery experts, and neurologists. Their conclusions were mixed. All three showed signs of severe sensory deprivation, trauma-induced hallucinations, and identity fragmentation. But then, some symptoms didn't make sense. They exhibited no vitamin deficiency, no signs of extended isolation psychosis, no immune collapse despite 16 years underground. One doctor noted that their internal biological clocks, measured through sleep cycles and hormonal rhythms, were still attuned to daylight hours, as if someone had controlled their artificial environment with unnatural precision. One of the tapes had shown Lena standing alone, facing the wall, her lips moving silently. Then she turned to the camera and said, "She's almost ready. He says the stars are almost aligned again." Then the tape cut off. The phrase again chilled everyone watching. Meanwhile, back in Fairfield, Heather returned to the house on Aldergrove Lane for the first time since the rescue. The yard was overgrown. The porch sagged. The windows were clouded with age. But she unlocked the door with the same brass key she had carried in her purse for 16 years. Inside, everything was as she left it. The children's rooms remained frozen in time. Lena's unicorn poster still taped to the wall, Emily's dolls still arranged in a tea party circle, Josh's toy dinosaur, half missing its tail, lying at the foot of the stairs. Heather didn't cry. She just stood in the hallway, listening. And then she heard it, a scratching sound, coming from beneath the floorboards. Authorities were called. The floor was torn up. Nothing was found. But that night, Heather began to draw too. A symbol, the same circle with 4 slashes. Meanwhile, Detective Reese Hamilton was chasing something he couldn't name. The fire at the barn had destroyed most of the physical evidence, but he'd managed to retrieve damaged frames from a few of the VHS tapes. His team sent them to forensic video restoration. One frame showed something new. Not the children, not the ritual room, but a person, just a silhouette, tall, thin, standing in the far corner of the room where the children slept. A single frame, less than a second. No facial features, no movement, but the timestamp placed it months after the last known recording date. The camera had kept rolling after the children were gone. Someone had returned, and they weren't alone. Further investigation of the property records revealed something else. The man who had filed the original land purchase in 1986 used a false identity. Michael Reeve, age 51, with no known family. But Michael Reeve had appeared in records before, decades earlier, attached to another barn, another abandoned structure in Kansas. A barn that had mysteriously burned down in 1963, killing several livestock but no humans. The name came up again in a 1977 report about missing teenagers in Washington. and again in a 1981 cult raid in Idaho. No exists, no bodies, just the same name, scribbled on a list of congregants found at the scene. Reeve M. Voice of Hollow. The voice had traveled. Hamilton flew out to interview Maris again. The retired detective was now under medical care, sliding between lucidity and confusion, but she brightened when she heard his voice. "You found a face, didn't you?" she asked. "What face?" Hamilton replied. "The one on the ceiling." "They always draw her on the ceiling." He leaned forward. "Who draws her?" "They do. The ones who come after." "After what?" She stared out the window. "After the tunnel." Later that evening, Hamilton received a call from the facility housing the Caldwell children. Josh had disappeared. No one had seen him leave. No alarms were triggered. His shoes were still in the room. His sheets undisturbed. There was one thing left behind, a note written in childlike scrawl. "She called me. I'm going home to the bottom. Don't follow. She doesn't like eyes." Panic ignited. Search teams were dispatched. Every inch of the facility combed. Cameras reviewed. Nothing. The facility was locked down. Lena collapsed in the hallway that night, screaming in a voice no one recognized. She was sedated. When she woke up, she said he took Josh. I told him not to talk back to her. She hates the smallest voice. Emily tried to hurt herself. She slammed her head into the wall until they restrained her. In the hospital bed, she whispered, "The crying is louder now. It's under my skin. I think she wants out." And in Heather's house, strange things began to happen. Lights flickered at 3 a.m. Radios turned on by themselves, playing static. Heather reported hearing footsteps upstairs, though she lived alone. One morning, she found the basement door wide open. And on the wall, drawn in what looked like rust, was that same face. The eyeless woman, mouth open, crying. She called James, frantic. He drove over, found her in the bathtub, fully clothed, trembling. "She's awake," Heather whispered. "She's awake, and she remembers me." That night, the Caldwell house burned. No signs of arson. No faulty waiting. It just caught fire. Like the barn. Heather survived. But something was found in the wreckage. Buried in the ash where Lena's room once was, firefighters found a small metal box. Inside were photographs. Black and white. Dated decades before 1988. Photos of children. Some laughing. Some standing still. All in the same backyard. Different faces, same swing set. Same house. Their house. The last photo showed 3 children standing side by side. One girl with long hair. One girl with short pigtails. And a little boy holding a plastic dinosaur. But it couldn't be them. The photo was dated September 7th, 1953. The photo refused to make sense. The date scrawled on the back in faded ink, September 7th, 1953, was undeniable. The paper was aged, brittle, clearly authentic. In the image, 3 children in the exact formation as Lena, Emily, and Josh, standing before a familiar oak tree, with the same tire swing that once creaked in their yard, sent a tremor through every room it was shown in. But it couldn't be them. Not possible. Not unless time bent backwards. Not unless history repeated itself in ways darker than anyone could grasp. James sat across from Detective Hamilton in the county office the day after the fire, the photograph laid carefully between them, held in a plastic evidence sleeve. His hands trembled as he stared at the faces. "It's them," he whispered. "It's them, but it's not." Hamilton didn't respond. He had stared at the same photo all night, checked it against every known facial analysis system available. The algorithms agreed. 92.7% match for Lena. 89% for Emily. 94% for Josh. Too close to ignore. Too disturbing to explain. Then another report came in. The fire at the Caldwell house had unearthed a second tunnel beneath the property. Emergency crews, believing it might connect to the original barn location, called in Hamilton. He arrived just after sunrise, the air thick with soot and silence. The entrance was hidden beneath what used to be Lena's bedroom closet, beneath layers of concrete and charred flooring. The tunnel was narrow, descending sharply, and unlike the first, this one wasn't reinforced with steel or plywood. It was made of stone, old stone carved smooth. Some parts bore symbols, rudimentary ones, spirals and crosses, crude human shapes with hollow circles where eyes should be. The walls were wet. The air smelled of mildew and iron. They followed it, down and down, 60 feet, then 80, then nearly 100 before they reached a chamber. It wasn't big, maybe 12 by 12 feet, but what it contained shattered all sense of logic. Lining the walls were drawings, thousands of them, faded with moisture but intact, pinned with rusted nails. Pages of children's handwriting, desperate notes, pages from old books, and always the symbol, the circle, the 4 slashes. In the center of the chamber was a small stone slab, and on it a wax cylinder recorder, a device not made since the 1930s. Next to it, a box of cylinders labeled in black marker. Voices, Mother's Choir. Hamilton ordered the area sealed. The cylinders were transferred to a lab for digitization. Days passed. The recordings were restored, and what they revealed changed everything. The first voice was that of a young girl. British accent, roughly 10 years old. "My name is Catherine. If you find this, please tell my parents I didn't mean to hear her." Then static. Another voice, this time a boy. "She's in the walls. She wants out. He said if we sleep too long, she'll get angry." Another. "He said we were the new mouths, that we had to carry her songs. I tried to forget them. I tried." Each voice came from a different era. Some spoke with dialects out of place in time. Others pleaded for help. Some sang, but all shared the same undercurrent. Fear of a woman they never saw, who wept when they disobeyed, who whispered from ceilings, who punished the voice who failed to carry her tune. Hamilton didn't sleep for 3 days. Then Lena ran away. It happened on a rainy Sunday night. No signs of forced entry. The door to her room was left ajar. Security footage showed her walking calmly down the hallway, barefoot, in a hospital gown. She left no note, except for one thing. Her final drawing, left taped to the mirror in her room. It showed the 3 of them, herself, Emily, and Josh, standing in front of the same oak tree. But this time the sky above them was black, and from that sky hung ropes. Dozens of them, and from each rope dangled a figure with no eyes. Beneath it, in a child's careful handwriting, "She takes the voices home again." Emily was sedated when they told her. She didn't react, but later, she turned to her nurse and said, "We'll all go back." She made sure. Then she wept. Hamilton revisited the barn site. It had been fully excavated now, reduced to rubble. But something else had surfaced, literally. Heavy rainfall and erosion had uncovered an old septic tank a few yards from the tunnel entrance. Investigators had written it off as irrelevant. But Hamilton didn't. Inside the tank were bones. Not human. Goat, dog, rabbit, and other remains too decayed to identify. And along the inner walls, carvings. Dozens of them. Deep gouges in the concrete. Again, that symbol. Again, those phrases. She feeds through faith. The smallest voices are the purest. He was her throat. Heather Caldwell suffered a breakdown days after Lena disappeared again. She was found wandering Route 26 barefoot, muttering phrases in a language no one recognized. At the hospital, she begged for the staff to remove the lights. "She can't find me in the dark," she cried. They sedated her, but as they wheeled her into the psychiatric wing, she turned to James, standing helpless behind the glass, and said, she never wanted them gone. She wanted them quiet. The voices were too loud. He collapsed in the waiting room. In early April, a ranger in eastern Washington found Josh. He was in a cave, naked, barely conscious, muttering to himself. He had dug symbols into the cave walls with his fingernails. He was taken into custody, unresponsive. On his body, they found carvings. Deep into the flesh of his back, the circle with 4 slashes. He had done it to himself. He was taken to a high-security facility. For 3 days, he said nothing. Then he asked for Hamilton. When the detective arrived, Josh whispered one sentence. "She showed me what came before." "What does that mean?" Hamilton asked. Josh looked up, tears streaming down his hollow face. "She was buried once. Before us. Before all of this. And someone dug her up." "Boo." Josh didn't answer. He smiled and began to hum. It was a lullaby. Faint, familiar. Hamilton had heard it before on one of the tapes. The melody was identical, but it wasn't recorded in 1988. It had been recorded in 1913. An archivist at the State University matched the tune to a traditional English lullaby popular among mining communities in the early 20th century. A song sung to children to keep them calm in the dark. Hush thee now, don't let her see the hollow eyes that wait for thee. Hamilton returned to the Caldwell ruins one last time. The city had already begun demolition, but he asked for 1 hour alone inside what was left of the basement. He walked the perimeter, examined the collapsed wall where the tunnel had first been found. Then he saw it, carved beneath the concrete. Only visible once a chunk had broken loose was a name. Not Clay, not Reeve, just one word, over and over. Eloan, no surname, no date, just the name. When he returned to the department, he pulled old census records, library archives, church logs. In 1889, a woman named Eloan Wren had been institutionalized in a private sanatorium 20 miles outside of Portland. She had been found wandering the forest naked, singing a lullaby to the trees. She was 7 years old. No family ever claimed her. She never spoke a word in the sanatorium, except once. She wrote something on her wall with chalk the night before she hanged herself in her cell. It was a circle with 4 slashes, and beneath it, in crooked letters, "The children will carry my song until someone listens again." The rain hadn't stopped for 3 days straight. It wasn't heavy, just a persistent drizzle that soaked into everything and made the very bones of the town feel damp and tired. Evelyn Harper sat alone on her porch, watching the ripples dance across the puddles forming at the edges of the cracked concrete. Her eyes, once sharp and full of fire, had dulled to a glassy, far-off stare. But her ears, they perked when she heard footsteps behind her. It had been 16 years since her children vanished. 16 slow, brutal years since the morning of May 6th, 1988, when the world tilted off its axis and never righted itself. And now, 2 weeks after the unbelievable had happened, after her 3 children were found alive, everything should have been right again. But it wasn't. Detectives from the state came in that night. There were questions, photographs, medical tests, counseling sessions. All 3 children, Michael, 9, Liam, 7, and little Chloe, just 5, were malnourished but alive. They hadn't aged a day. The news ran it in. Every headline, miracle in Millersfield. Children return after 16 years, unchanged. But there were no real answers, only disturbing facts. The children had been found in a barn 18 miles from town, standing in a corner like statues, their clothes unchanged, skin pale and clammy, speaking in whispers. A farmer had gone into the barn after hearing what he thought was a radio playing soft lullabies. Evelyn had run to them, screamed their names as she wrapped her arms around their fragile bodies. She had cried until her eyes swelled shut. But as the hours passed, that joy dissolved into a slow, creeping dread. Because something wasn't right. They didn't remember anything, not even their names. Chloe still clutched the frayed edge of her favorite blanket. Liam blinked repeatedly, as though adjusting to a new atmosphere. Michael watched everything in silence, eyes locked on corners of rooms where no one stood. Dr. O'Hara, a neurological specialist from Chicago, examined them at Millersfield County Hospital. After 5 hours, she told Evelyn and Aaron, her estranged husband, that while the children had no visible injuries or neurological damage, their scans looked like that of someone just waking from a long, dreamless sleep. Except for one anomaly, none of their brains showed any typical developmental change. "They haven't aged," O'Hara whispered, almost to herself. Aaron had been pacing. He stopped cold. "What do you mean, haven't aged? Not just physically, biologically, cognitively. They're still children." The town's whisper network ignited like wildfire. Some said it was a government experiment. Others swore it was a miracle or a curse. Rumors swirled about an abandoned Cold War bunker in the forest. Others mentioned the old Gregory farm, long shuttered after a fire in '79 where the owners had died in the cellar under suspicious circumstances. Then came the tapes. 2 nights after the children were brought home, a box was left on the Harpers' doorstep. No note. Inside were 6 VHS tapes, labeled with dates ranging from 1989 to 2004. Aaron dusted off the old player, and he and Evelyn sat frozen as the screen crackled to life. The footage was in black and white, grainy but unmistakable. Their children in a small, windowless room with concrete walls. Each tape was about 10 minutes long. The kids never aged, and their behaviors were the same, silent, occasionally staring upward as if someone were speaking to them. On tape 3, Liam screamed for 7 minutes straight, then suddenly stopped and smiled into the camera. Evelyn vomited halfway through. The tapes were turned over to Detective Markham, who'd taken a personal interest in the case. He had been a rookie in '88, assigned to the search teams. Now, older and hardened, he carried the weight of those years like stones in his coat pockets. "I think someone was observing them," he muttered. "Documenting something. But why haven't they changed?" Aaron asked, his hands trembling. Markham didn't respond. He had noticed something else. In the corner of every tape, just above the children's heads, was a dark figure. It never moved. It had no discernible face, just a silhouette. By tape 6, it was standing closer. The children didn't speak for days, until one night Chloe walked into Evelyn's room and whispered, "He doesn't like the lights." That same night, every bulb in the Harper home exploded. Now, sleep became impossible. Evelyn would sit awake. The children huddled in her bed. Every night, at precisely 3:33 a.m., the hallway grew colder. The air thickened, and from the living room came the sound of the lullaby again, the same one from the tapes. Aaron moved back in temporarily, though the wounds between him and Evelyn had never healed. They tried to make sense of it together, try to act normal for the kids. But normal was impossible when your daughter whispered secrets to dolls that weren't hers, or when Liam sat in the backyard and counted backward from 100 to 1, over and over. Michael finally spoke one afternoon. He looked straight into Markham's eyes and said, "He kept us in the forever room." "What is the forever room?" Markham asked. Michael stared. "You'll see." The following day, Markham and a federal team searched the barn where the children were found. Under layers of dirt and hay, they uncovered a hatch that led to a concrete spiral staircase. 20 feet down, it opened into a chamber lined with monitors and recording equipment, all turned off. On one wall was a mural, drawings made in crayon, childlike and erratic. One drawing showed 3 children and a tall figure with no face. The words "he watches in the stillness" were scrawled over and over. Then they found the files. Hundreds of case studies, notes in meticulous handwriting, subject IDs, dates, behavioral observations. Some referred to temporal suspension. Others mentioned something called the silent host. One note read, "Children most receptive to crossover phase. Delay aging. Retains spiritual malleability." Whatever had happened to the Harper children wasn't a one-time event. It was a controlled study, one that may have been running for decades. The last file was dated May 5, 1988, one day before the kids vanished. It read simply, "Transfer confirmed. The watcher is ready." But the scariest part came when Chloe drew a picture during a therapy session. She handed it to Dr. O'Hara and whispered, "He's still waiting." The drawing showed the Harper house. All the windows were blacked out. In the sky above, a dark figure loomed, and inside the house, Evelyn, Aaron, and the children were all asleep in their beds. Every single bed had a pair of glowing white eyes underneath it, and in the corner of the page, smaller than anything else, a single line of text. "We never really came back.